see this? The NRC ends work on National Academy of Sciences Cancer Risk Pilot Study. The NRC is ceasing work on a National Academy of Sciences NAS pilot study, Phase 1 and Phase 2 of cancer risks in populations near U.S. nuclear power facilities. The NRC determined that continuing the work was impractical. The NRC is basically saying it's too expensive to find out how much damage these nuclear power reactors doing around the public. It's just too expensive, guys. We can't look into it. The NRC continues to find U.S. nuclear power plants comply with the strictest requirements that limit radiation releases from routine operations. The NRC and state agencies regularly analyze environmental samples from near the plants. These analyses show the releases, when they occur, they're just too small to cause observable increases in cancer risk near the facilities. But we won't show them to you because they're just too small to report. We're balancing the desire to provide updated answers on cancer risks with our responsibility to use congressionally provided funds. You're getting congressionally provided funds and you're into the damage of localized power reactors across the United States? The hell are you doing? What are you getting congressional money for? You can't notify and protect the public like you say on your logo? We're balancing the desire to provide updated answers on cancer risk with our responsibility to use congressionally provided funds as wisely as possible, said Brian Sharon, Director of the NRC Office of Nuclear Regulatory Research. The NAS estimates it would be at least the end of the decade before they would possibly have answers for us, and the costs of completing the study were prohibitively high.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
I mean, it just seems like it's always worse than we've been told. Describe for us the situation there now, David, with all these holding tanks, hundreds of tons being captured in them every day, some of them leaking, and I guess they're continuing to build more. What's going on there?
Well, as you know, the tsunami and earthquake of 2.5 years ago caused it would shut down the cooling system to the power plant, and that led to the meltdown of 3 of the reactors. And there's 3 huge blobs, 100 tons plus of melted uranium fuel in the bottom of those reactors, and the only way that they can keep it cool is by pouring water on it every day, and that goes on 24 hours, and it has gone on since this disaster began. And of course that water, when it touches the fuel, becomes radioactive. Now what they're trying to do is to decontaminate that water as much as they can, but it's only partially decontaminated, and then it's stored in these tanks. So if you go onto the site, you see that the only thing that appears to have changed in the last 2 years on site, apart from sort of cleaning up the debris, is that these tanks have mushroomed. There are now about 1,100 of them. They hold 1,000 tons of water each. They're makeshift. They're, in some cases, not put together very well. This is what we've learned in the last couple of months, of course. Some of the joints are made with sealant, and the sealant, it's believed, is corroding because of the radiation. And one of those joints, at least, as far as we know, has leaked radioactive water. Now, what's sort of astonishing from the point of view of people who are looking at what's going on is that TEPCO, despite all of these problems, still seems to have these real gaps in its knowledge about what it's doing. So, for example, it took it a long time, days, possibly even weeks, to notice that 300 tons of highly radioactive water had leaked from one of those tanks. And what we learned this week is that they're scrambling now to try and find workers who can monitor those tanks, because they had a very small team of people going around the power plant checking them, and they were visually checking them. They don't actually have any gauges on these tanks, so they're very prone to leaks, and what we suspect is that this leak that we had recently is not a one-off, but it may point to a generic problem of leaks at the power plant, and that's the really scary part of this latest phenomenon.
So TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, the company that owns this and has been in charge of the cleanup. I'm looking at aerial view of Fukushima here, the plant, and much of it looks familiar, except for, as you say, this giant tank farm that's grown around it, 400 tons of cooling water being collected in tanks each day. So this farm continues to grow. This does not sound at all like a sustainable operation. You've called this, a machine for generating radioactive water. That doesn't sound too good.
Yes, well, that's not my phrase. A lot of people have called it a machine for generating radioactive water, and as you say, it doesn't appear to be sustainable. And in fact, the NRA chairman who you just quoted, Tanaka-san, he actually said for the first time yesterday at a press conference that TEPCO will have to release some of this water into the sea. And what he said was that the water would be decontaminated to acceptable international standards, that the radioactive release would not be harmful to the environment. But really, we only have his word for that and the word of TEPCO. And there are also lots of sort of suggestions about ways to keep this fuel cool. One of them is that it could be air-cooled, but that means that the entire system that they have used, that TEPCO has used for cooling this nuclear fuel for the last 2.5 years, would have to be changed. And they would also have to call in a lot of international help, including help from America. And so far, there doesn't seem to be much sign that that's happening.
So we've got this proliferation of tanks full of radioactive water, just tons and tons and tons and hundreds of tons. And then, something like an underground river running under the plant here, which they're worried about carrying that leaking radioactive water out to sea by. And the news today that the government will put up something like $500 million, the equivalent thereof, to build an ice wall to stop this water from running into the sea. How's that work, David?
Well, there's two separate problems, if you like. One is the water that they're using to cool the uranium fuel, and the other problem is water that's running into the power plant from the surrounding hills and mountains and whenever it rains. And that water becomes groundwater, and it gets contaminated when it touches the contaminated water. It mixes with the contaminated water. And, of course, it's leaking into the sea. And what's really making people angry is that TEPCO for months denied that it was leaking into the sea and has only recently come clean. So the problem of what to do with all this water sloshing around the plant is really the headache, if you like, of the moment. And, of course, there is another set of problems which, in some ways is even more challenging, because what the engineers have to do once they get this leak problem fixed is they have to find a way to extract this highly radioactive nuclear fuel, and also to dismantle a fuel pool in the damaged Reactor 4 building. There's 1,500 fuel rods in the damaged 4 reactor building which have to be extracted one by one, again highly radioactive, a massive engineering job before they can decommission this plant. So, it's only one, but really the leaking water is only one of a number of headaches. Now, what the government has done today is it has given a total of $470 million, or it's promised that to TEPCO, to try and fix the most immediate problem, which is leaking water. And they will build, we're told what they'll do is they'll build this artificial wall, an ice wall, around the most damaged reactors in a bid to keep the groundwater, groundwater that's leaking into the plant, from coming into contact with contaminated water that's been used to cool the fuel rods. And it's anybody's guess, really, if that will work. I'm sure nuclear engineers on your program later on will be better qualified to comment on that.
I mean, it sounds like science fiction, something out of a Marvel comic book, a giant ice wall to hold back the poison. And the politics here, David. You've got Prime Minister Abe at the head of a pro-nuclear power party in power in Japan. What difference has that made in the way the national government in Tokyo is looking at this, talking about it?
Well, I think the main difference, as far as we can tell from our perspective, is that, first of all, there is this suspicion that the government and the regulators have taken their eye off the Daiichi power plant a little bit, because they are concerned about restarting the other commercial reactors in Japan as quickly as possible.
They shut down, all 50 or 60 of them after Daiichi, Fukushima? Meltdown.
That's right. So they've all been shut down sort of not immediately after Fukushima, but as a result of Fukushima, the safety checks have become much more stringent. And, of course, the restart of each power plant has become a political issue in each host town, host prefecture where they're based. and that has slowed down these restarts. So yes, as you say, all 50 commercial reactors will be offline, or are actually offline this month. That makes Japan nuclear free for the second time, I should say, since 1971 and 1972.
How long are we talking for this nuclear zone around the power plant here? 10 more years, 50 more years, 100 more years?
Well, that's anybody's guess as well. I mean, I've just been up there, and what's very clear is, first of all, that the estimated contamination that there is up there, the radiation is falling, but very, very slowly. The government is spending billions of dollars to try and decontaminate the areas immediately around the power plant that were home to about 160,000 people. But most of the people that we talk to who are from those areas believe that they will never go back. Of course, there are some old people who will return, but in general, people say they don't have a hope of going home.
David McNeil in Tokyo, reporting there for The Economist and The Independent, co-author of Strong in the Rain. Thank you very much for getting us started today, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
But the concentrations, we have to remember there was cesium in the Pacific Ocean before this accident, left over from the 1960s. And so by some estimates, it will go up a factor of 2, a factor of 5 at concentrations that are nowhere near what we've seen off coastal Japan. So, in terms of our health, I have no concern for those levels in the ocean, swimming, bathing, even closer to Japan. In terms of seafood, again, that's a coastal Japan issue right now. It could change as we hear about these continued leaks of different isotopes. But for the cesium isotopes that have been most prevalent and monitored and caused the closing of fisheries off Japan, that particular isotope actually becomes less and less in the body as the fish swim across. The tuna we heard about, fish that swim out, were about 20 times lower in their concentration of that cesium isotope off San Diego than off Japan. And I'm not saying we won't be able to detect it off the west coast of the U.S., but the levels by then aren't the health concern that we have for the people living in Japan and perhaps consuming some of the seafood over there. The fisheries are closed, but that's more of a localized health concern.
Now, the cleanup has been anything but efficient so far. What if it's not done well? I mean, just speak frankly about what the risks are if this goes badly or isn't well handled.
Right, and certainly there's many, many more times of these isotope inventories on land than have already reached the ocean, and we call it unprecedented. We were very concerned back in March and April 2011 that this might get out of control and we'd have a more widespread contamination, not just in coastal fisheries, but beyond. So, we're not out of the woods yet in terms of the potential, but we have to continue monitoring that and make sure not just cesium, but some of these other isotopes aren't getting into the food chain. And some of them, strontium, as I mentioned, is more of a bone-seeking isotope that doesn't leave the fishes readily. It gets in their bones, and if they are eating the small fish whole, as many of them are in Japan, then that would get into our system for much longer periods of time. So,
speak plainly about that potential risk, because this goes to people's calculations long-term about nuclear energy and how they assess risk. I mean, here this plant is, even if it's entombed for millennia, Per Peterson hopes that doesn't happen, but if it's right on the coast, it's in tsunami territory, it's in earthquake zone. If it should get, let's say the whole darn thing washed into the sea, what would the global implications be, Ken?
Again, that's hard to say. Maybe we can ask Per Peterson about the total inventories of these isotopes. But now we're talking about something that would exceed, the weapons testing I mentioned in the 60s was about 20 times larger than, say, the total cesium release from Chernobyl, which is slightly larger than Fukushima. So we're talking about something, if it's thousands of times bigger, then we do have concerns. But we don't consider the Pacific Ocean right now, before the accident, to be particularly radioactive, despite the fact that's where we conducted a lot of nuclear weapons testing. And likewise, the Irish Sea, people probably haven't heard of or forgotten about Sellafield, a reprocessing plant that's still there. And in the 60s and 70s, it released an amount of cesium that's comparable, actually, to what we're seeing in Fukushima.
Ken, forgive me, but I have to persist on this point, because there's a kind of, I just don't hear a plain answer. If there was a quake and this thing just fell whole hog into this, the whole thing slid in. I mean, and don't write it off, because who knows? Can this kind of thing contaminate a body of water as vast as the Pacific Ocean in such a way that its full food stock would be threatened and would be inedible?
It's a good question, but I find that a bit hypothetical. I think it would be hard to contaminate the entire Pacific. We just have such a huge inventory. And again, we've added in 10 to 20 times before, haven't seen detrimental effects in terms of what we consider unsafe levels. And so someone's going to have to tell me if this is going to be a million times larger or 10,000 times larger. Those things make a big difference, right, in terms of these calculations.
Per Peterson,
okay. Numbers that I don't know.
Per Peterson, speak to those numbers. You say you could dump the tanks to get in there and fix the fuel cells and entomb them, but you know, what about you're talking millennia here. In a millennia, lots of things can happen.
Even at this point, after 2.5 years.
Even as this reactor sits in all its distress. Dick in Nashville, Tennessee. Dick, you're on the air.
Hi, you know, I used to live in Los Angeles, and we lived in a neighborhood for 15 years, and then we found out there was the worst nuclear accident happened in 1959, 2 miles from where we lived, and it still has not been cleaned up. They don't plan on cleaning it up for another 10 years.
So?
Well, I just think America should be aware that we have the problem in our own country, where we don't clean up our nuclear accidents.
Yeah, I mean, look, absolutely, problems all over the place. In the cleanup in Japan, if they should take the path that you suggest, they got to go in there underwater, up in these cooling towers, saw these fuel rods down to size, entomb them, and then do what with them, Per?
Well, the debris that comes out of the reactor would be handled in very similar ways to the normal spent fuel, and most likely would be placed ultimately into geologic disposal as one would spent fuel, although the Japanese also have a reprocessing plant at Rokashomura, which could be used to treat this damaged fuel. At 3 Mile Island, the work was done underwater, and the damaged fuel was broken and cut up into smaller pieces, placed into canisters, and then actually transported to Idaho National Laboratory so that they could inspect it inside hot cells. And much of our understanding of severe accident phenomenology and many of the engineered features that are in the plants to mitigate the consequences, unfortunately not used correctly during the Fukushima accident, but that knowledge comes from this experience at TMI. And the cleanup at TMI, I think, provides a lot of good models for what needs to be done at Fukushima. But things such as delaying the pumping of the water out of the reactor buildings and leaving critical equipment immersed in corrosive water is, I think, showing that there's a misdirection of the effort there towards activities that really don't reduce risk as much as you could by focusing on getting the damaged fuel out of the reactors.
Ken Bisler, there you are at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. What do you think of the idea of pumping that water out into the sea so they can get in to deal with the core issue? Does it look safe to you to do that?
Well, I think there's a wide range in contamination levels. I know they can't even take clean groundwater upstream and put that in the ocean because of opposition from some of the local fisheries groups. The tank we heard about that leaked the other day, that had extremely high levels of some of the beta emitters, including strontium-90, and that would not have been safe. And that's the number I was talking about, that 10 or so of those tanks would equal the entire amount of strontium that was delivered 2 years ago, and that's going to become a persistent problem and hang around longer in the food chain. The other point, too, is while most of these isotopes we've talked about move quickly with the currents, there is still a small fraction, and a small fraction of a big number is a significant amount of cesium in the seafloor sediments, and that's going to be there for many years, if not decades. So while the ocean dilution process goes on, there's also a concentration into things that settle to the bottom, and that's probably one reason why the bottom fish in particular, the ones that live on that material, the plants and critters down there, they tend to be the highest in some of these radionuclides. So we have to think about that whole pathway into the ocean before we consider what we're going to release and how much.
Per Peterson, there's all kinds of questions raised here about nuclear power universally, but in particular, maybe we just shouldn't be building nuclear power plants on earthquake fault lines in tsunami country on the coast of the Pacific, any ocean at all.
Well, if you take a look at the situation, there was knowledge in Japan 10 years, more than a decade in advance of this accident, that large tsunamis are possible. sort of the tragedy is that no action was taken to upgrade the defenses.
This documentary should not exist. Doctors and scientists have been sentenced to prison for exposing the information presented within, and the governments of the world would rather you never laid your eyes upon it. For the blood of millions is on their hands, and indeed, much credit is due to the blood, the sweat, and the tears of all of those who sacrificed so much to get their stories on film. And although the
racing to create jobs and command growing energy industries. And nuclear energy is no exception. Japan and France have long invested heavily in this industry. Meanwhile, there are 56 nuclear reactors under construction around the world, 21 in China alone, 6 in South Korea, 5 in India. I know it's been long assumed that those who champion the environment are opposed to nuclear power. But the fact is, even though we've not broken ground on a new nuclear power plant in 30 years, nuclear energy remains our largest source of fuel that produces no carbon emissions. To meet our growing energy needs and prevent the worst consequences of climate change, we'll need to increase our supply of nuclear power. It's that simple.
consultant, physics professor Michio Kaku. Professor, we've seen the helicopters dropping water on the site. If that doesn't work, what's next?
That helicopter dropping borated water is like a squirt gun trying to put out a forest fire. Too little, too late. I think we're extremely close now to the point of no return. Just a few more slight glitches, and we're going to be in an uncontrolled breach of containment. That is a Class 7 accident. That is a full-scale Chernobyl.
You think meltdown's inevitable at this point?
Almost inevitable. At a certain point, the workers going into that site will be on a suicide mission. They will have to abandon ship. And without anyone taking care of the reactor cores, we will have 3 simultaneous breach of containments. Already, Units 2 and Unit 3 have cracks in their containment vessels. Already, Unit 4 has a raging fire, we think, involving spent fuel that is not contained by any containment vessel. So we are very close now to something that is even bigger than Chernobyl.
So, Professor, what's the worst-case scenario look like in that area 12 miles around the reactor if, in fact, there is a meltdown? I mean, are people going to die within that region? What about the radiation plume?
In a worst-case scenario, you have breach of containment. The containment structure springs a leak. You have an explosion. The thing cracks apart and releases large quantities of radiation into the atmosphere. That area will become a dead zone. It will be impossible to grow anything. People in that area will die. We're talking about lives at stake. And that's why I would say, if I had the ear of the Prime Minister, forget about using squirt guns. Call in the Japanese Air Force. Hit that reactor with concrete, sand, and boric acid. Seal it in a sarcophagus. Entomb it just like the Soviets entombed the Chernobyl accident in 1986. I think we're very close to that option now.
We're going to have to leave it there. Professor Kaku, our thanks.
To discuss this issue, we're joined by British journalist George Monbiot in London. He's an author, columnist with The Guardian of London. He's written in favor of nuclear energy after the Fukushima disaster. George Monbiot, why don't you begin? Why doesn't what is happening now in Fukushima concern you when it comes to nuclear power worldwide?
Well, obviously what's happening in Fukushima concerns me a lot about the area surrounding Fukushima. It's a horrible, dangerous, extremely traumatic series of events that we are seeing there. But I'm very worried that the global response to what's happening in Fukushima will be to shut down nuclear power stations around the world and to cancel future nuclear power stations, and that what will happen is that they will be replaced by coal. Now, coal is hundreds of times more dangerous than nuclear power, not just because of climate change, though of course climate change is the big one, but also because of industrial accidents and because of the impacts of pollution on local people. If we just look at industrial accidents alone, these massively outweigh both the fatalities and the injuries caused by any nuclear accident we've ever seen. In China alone, last year, 2,300 people were killed in industrial accidents to do with coal mining. Purely by coal mining accidents, 2,300 killed. That's 6 people a day. That means that in 1 week, the official death toll from coal in China is greater than the official death toll from Chernobyl in 25 years.
We are going right now to Burlington, Vermont, to speak with Arnie Gundersen, former nuclear industry senior vice president, who's coordinating projects at 70 nuclear power plants around the country. Arnie Gundersen provides independent testimony on nuclear and radiation issues to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and congressional and state legislatures, as well as government agencies and officials in the U.S. and abroad. Now chief engineer at Fairwinds Association, he co-wrote the new Greenpeace report, Lessons from Fukushima. What are these lessons, Arnie Gundersen?
Well, I think the first lesson is that this is a technology that can destroy a nation. I was reading Mikhail Gorbachev's memoirs, and he claims that it was Chernobyl, not perestroika, that destroyed the Soviet Union. And as you look at the transcripts coming out of Japan, we see that the Fukushima accident was on the verge of causing the evacuation of Tokyo. And had the wind been blowing the other way across the island instead of out to sea, Japan would have been cut in half and destroyed as a functional country. So this is a technology where perhaps accidents don't happen every day, but when they do, they can destroy a country. The other things are the cost is astronomical. To fix this is going to be something on the order of $500 billion. All of the money that Japan saved on oil over the 40 years that they've had nuclear plants just got thrown away in the $500 billion recovery effort.
Когда мы будем знать степень распространения, то есть наличие поражения лимфоузлов, опять же, то есть тогда мы можем более конкретно это прогнозировать.
And we're joined by Helen Caldicott, world-renowned anti-nuclear advocate, author, and pediatrician, co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, has spent decades warning of the medical hazards of nuclear technologies.
A new report from the New York Academy of Sciences has just translated 5,000 papers from Russian into English. It's the most devastating report I've ever seen. Up to 1 million people have already died from Chernobyl. And people will continue to die from cancer for virtually the rest of time.
The United Nations Committee did examine Chernobyl, and they said that so far the death toll from Chernobyl amongst both workers and local people is 43. When I've been dealing with climate change over the past 20 years or so, I learned very quickly that you have to effectively go with the scientific consensus rather than with a few outlier papers, because to choose those outlier papers over the scientific consensus is effectively to cherry pick or to data mine and to get what turns out to be a misleading view. That's certainly been my experience with climate change.
A United Nations press release published by the World Health Organization in conjunction with the International Atomic Energy Agency, does indeed state that less than 50 people have died thus far from Chernobyl, but they also do admit that about 4,000 children contracted thyroid cancer. But according to the United Nations, this thyroid cancer has a 99% survivability rate, making it the most survivable form of cancer in the world according to the United Nations. Yet it appears there are still people left at the UN with a conscience. Take this statement by Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations. Chernobyl is a word we would all like to erase from our memory. It opened a Pandora's box of invisible enemies and nameless anxieties in people's minds, but which most of us probably now think of as safely relegated to the past. Yet there are two compelling reasons why this tragedy must not be forgotten. First, if we forget Chernobyl, we increase the risk of more such technological and environmental disasters in the future. Second, more than 7 million of our fellow human beings do not have the luxury of forgetting. They are still suffering every day as a result of what happened 14 years ago. Indeed, the legacy of Chernobyl will be with us and with our descendants for generations to come.
Now, on these questions that Helen raises, I mean, if she's honestly saying that the World Health Organization is now part of the conspiracy and the cover-up as well, then the mind boggles. Where does this end?
The mind does boggle.
Them and the UN Scientific Committee and the IAEA and I mean, who else is involved in this conspiracy? We need to know.
To try to understand how it is that their governments and the governments of the world, who are after all people just like you, can permit the exposures of people to these substances when these substances are killing them and killing their children and causing increases in cancer. The way in which this works is that in 1952, at the beginning of the manufacture of all of these bombs, when they needed the bombs in order to stop the Soviet Union from taking over the planet, they developed an organization called the International Commission on Radiological Protection, the ICRP. And this organization assessed the health of exposure to radiation. But the real purpose of this organization was to set limits to radiation exposure which permitted the military to continue making bombs. Now, in order to make bombs, you have to have plutonium. And in order to get plutonium, you have to have nuclear energy, because that's where you make the plutonium. So the period from 1952 to 1965, say, was a period of expansion of the development of nuclear energy. And parallel with this, of course, was the production of plutonium by the nuclear energy reactors in order to make bombs. Now, the ICRP calculated the relationship between radiation and health on the basis of an idea called absorbed dose. Absorbed dose is energy per unit mass, so it's energy divided by mass. Now, the energy is energy that comes from the outside, external radiation. But this is okay as a method for assessing radiation from the outside, like from an atom bomb, but it doesn't work for measuring radiation from the inside, which is like something that you see here, which is like a little particle of radioactive plutonium, which is creating a lot of damage in one part of the cells. Here, there's one, there's another one, but nothing anywhere else. So you can think about sitting in front of a fire, a warm fire, and warming your body, and all of the energy goes into your body and warms it up. And you divide that energy by the weight, by the mass of your body in kilograms, and that gives you your dose. But you can get the same dose by reaching into the fire and picking out a hot coal and eating it. Same dose. And this represents the error, the mistake, that is built in to the current system of radiation protection. And because of this mistake, which is not really a mistake, which is a scheme, which was set up in 1952 and is still with us, millions of people have died. Millions.
One special phase of the study concerned the amount of radiation that would pass through the human body. This required instrumentation in the stomach. A small capsule was devised as a film stack with alternate bits of film and spacers. Secured with a string and paraffin coated, the capsule is swallowed. One end of the string hangs out of the mouth so that the capsule can be retrieved after exposure and the radiation measured.
Gamma radiation may do its damage in either of two major ways, or both. One, it may physically and directly destroy tissue or eventually cause the development of some kind of cancer. Those which concern us principally have life periods ranging from several years to thousands of years. They can do no harm unless they are taken into our bodies with food or drinking water, or in the air we breathe.
Let us consider the results of a powerful thermonuclear explosion at the Pacific Proving Grounds in the Marshall Islands, 11 degrees north of the equator. The huge cloud soars up, punches through the tropopause, and finally spreads and stabilizes as high as 70 or 80,000 feet, entirely within the stratosphere layer.
This brings us to the most widely discussed fission product, strontium-90. Chemically similar to the soil calcium with which it becomes mixed, the strontium-90 follows calcium through its regular cycles into our plant food and into the bones, meat, and milk of our plant-eating animals. Reaching our own bodies, the strontium-90, like calcium, tends to be concentrated in our bone, particularly those of children who are building new bone. The radiation from strontium-90 has extremely short range in the body, so it causes no genetic threat to the reproductive cells. It does pose a threat to the bone marrow and the bone itself in the form of either leukemia or bone cancer. If this should happen, it would be a tragic thing for those injured, no matter how small the number. Whether these statistically very few casualties can be justified is a personal value judgment outside the scope of this report. Each citizen must make his or her own evaluation. There are those few who loudly maintain that there is no actual threat to the free world at all, certainly none that can justify either nuclear testing or nuclear armament. The opposite viewpoint holds that the development of our nuclear power has been an absolutely necessary protection against communist hostility and nuclear threats. In this view, the fallout casualties, if any, will be seen as those of unidentified soldiers in the service of humanity. Unknown soldiers in a war which has not struck, and which our nuclear power may indeed prevent from ever striking.
the governments of the world, those that lead the United Nations and comprise the UN Security Council, would like you to believe that the number of people afflicted with cancers, birth defects, and other radiation-related illnesses from the fallout of over 2,000 nuclear weapons detonations is statistically insignificant. But in order for that to be the case, the United Nations would also need you to believe that a full-scale nuclear meltdown like Chernobyl would only kill about 2 people a year. However, bear in mind that the average nuclear warhead only contains about 20 pounds of nuclear fuel. A nuclear power plant such as Fukushima Daiichi contains thousands of tons of nuclear fuel. And this is the reason why just one nuclear meltdown has the capacity to destroy an entire nation. A single nuclear disaster, such as a spent fuel pool fire, can release more radiation than the combined radiation of all the nuclear weapons tests ever conducted.
Damage. He reported this, and for his work, he was put in prison.
And he was put in prison?
He was put in prison, yes.
And he analyzed, these are animals that were...
Well, he did the original study on animals, and then he was a pathologist, and he was studying the results in children, and he found the same changes in the hearts of children who had died as he'd seen in the animals. And when he reported it, his thanks was he got arrested and put in prison.